Okay, welcome to the July meeting of the Kubernetes VMware user group. On the agenda today, we're planning to talk about what's upcoming with regard to the CSI storage plugin with Kubernetes, but we're waiting for that speaker to arrive. And while we're doing that, Robert had asked that we give an update on the status of Windows containers. So I tried to get a speaker on short notice and couldn't do it, but somebody has volunteered to present a month from now. But in the meantime, I think we can talk about it a little bit. So I whipped together a slide just in the last 10 minutes. Let me share that.
Well, I didn't mean to suddenly give you homework.
Yeah, well, you know, that's sort of the job of a chair, I think, is to drive these meetings and make them interesting. So I actually appreciate it because otherwise, can you see a desktop with PowerPoint running?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm just going to leave it in this mode rather than presenter mode, just because it's a little easier to get to the Zoom moderation controls if I do it. But yeah, Robert, with regard to the short notice, I'd rather have some asks from actual users rather than have to invent stuff on my own. So even if you want to jump in there 15 minutes before, I mean, a day before gives me a lot more headroom, but always appreciate it. So Windows containers in Kubernetes are now actually designated as stable is the terminology used in Kubernetes. Maybe you're more used to the term commonly used with vSphere as of GA release, but they are now not alpha or beta, but marked as stable. You know, you're welcome to interpret how stable. A lot of enterprises still aren't comfortable using a release 1.0, but they've been marked as stable. There's a doc link on that slide, so they're documented in the official Kubernetes documentation. And I just asked some of the developers of that feature what it is, and they said to me just within the last hour that they consider them quite stable. However, Kubernetes doesn't stand in isolation. You know, that the whole CNCF landscape has a complete tool chain of other components, which includes CNI network plugins, storage, etc. And I think there may indeed be issues with some of those. For example, before you make a commitment to go take this into production in your organization, there's more than just Kubernetes involved. So you might want to take a look at, you know, your choice of CNI plugin, storage plugin, to make sure that those are capable of a plug and play in a Windows environment. But at least some of them are. With regard to Kubernetes itself, I think it's designated as ready to go. Why would you want to use them? Well, I think the use cases are that there's a lot of software out there that's been developed for the Windows platform. And this isn't necessarily just a legacy story. I mean, there's people who have an issue where they have a big development staff that aren't ready to be retired or put out to pasture. And, you know, many organizations are faced with using the skill set of the people that they have now. And if you've got an army of people who are already trained in .NET, that for obvious reasons, you'd like to utilize these people. And these Windows containers are the way you would go about doing that. So it gives you a way to containerize existing .NET apps. I'll let the speakers will line up next month cover how that's done, but I believe that in some cases, your choice could be to containerize them using a Linux version of .NET, but in others, maybe Windows containers is going to be a more attractive part of that story. And I understand there's a lot of people looking at this just because some of these Windows platforms are either end of life already or going that way. so that it's not a case of whether you need, if you need a new platform, you do. And there are people looking at this. Now, David, you said that you've been looking at this very recently too, and maybe you have a few remarks.
Yeah, so there, like on an upcoming product release, there's supposed to be some support for Azure. So like naturally it lends to looking at like Windows related stuff. And so one of the things that I have to do is I have to validate like our components and stuff like that in CI/CD pipelines and stuff. And one of the line items is running stuff on Windows. And we do all our CI/CD stuff in Jenkins right now currently, and sometimes we've been adding more. Sorry, the phone's going off here. We do Concourse and Runway too, but most of our stuff's in Jenkins and it requires a Windows executor, or basically just a node in order to run natively on Windows. And based on what my experience, oh my gosh, there we go. Based on
that happens to all of us.
Yeah, based on my experience, like I initially, because I was like, hey, let's start not with the latest Windows because that's probably going to work. So 2019, and I started initially building a Windows executor node on Windows Server 2016. And I ran into a number of problems really quick. So like when they talk about Windows support, if I couldn't, I could get Docker and like all the other components to install on Windows on 2016, but I quickly found that the support for it was like very lacking. And when I mean very lacking, like when you're running like Docker just doing a Docker run, a hello world, like I immediately ran into issues where that, I guess whatever format that they're using in order to pull containers from like Docker registry or GCR, it was just no longer supported on that platform. And it's pretty obvious. Now I started pulling a bunch of random containers and like random images, and I ran into that same problem. And I ultimately came to the conclusion where I needed to go to Windows 2019 and only use that platform. And I actually found some documentation in Kubernetes land, which I'm going to plop in the chat here so everyone just can like look at it. And yeah, so basically I found that 2019 was the only like really quote unquote supported container or supported thing for running containers on Windows. After I switched to 2019, everything just started magically working, Hello World and all these other container runtimes. I'm not saying that you probably can't get it to run on 2016. It's just, I think your uphill curve is going to be high to get that thing to actually work. And I don't know how long they're going to continue to support that. And there's a number of things that I found that it didn't seem like that they were treating 2016 as something that they were going to continue to support with the latest stuff and like the underlying stuff that it required. So at least that's what my experience was with it.
I'd find the same sort of thing when I was trying to record demos that I had to use 2019. I was trying to use 2016 for ages, and I just couldn't make it work properly. And if you want the newer stuff like WSL2 and all those other nice bits and pieces that are built into the new versions of Windows 10, then you have to go to 2019. And that includes the single TCP IP stack for the WSL stuff and the Windows stuff. So if you want to do like localhost, then you need to go 2019, and just all the fundamental bits and pieces you expect from Linux containers they're still sort of not quite there.
So, yeah, what I was also interested in was understanding kind of the level of community support beyond just Kubernetes itself. So thinking in terms of things like observability, Prometheus or services that run as a sidecar, the various projects and integrations that we rely on to make a complete functioning stack. Of course, it's not clear to me how much those projects have to think specifically about the Windows container use case. I think it kind of depends on the project and the tooling, but to make make it operational in production requires quite a broad kind of community acceptance and representation of Windows as a runtime in those communities. So I'm kind of wondering how, beyond Kubernetes, if you run into things, or if maybe I'm overstating the difficulty.
I think maybe, well, from the conversations I've had with customers, I haven't met one that wants to run stuff on Windows seriously, like Windows Kubernetes seriously. I mean, I guess the argument is if your apps are built on .NET, you can use a framework like .NET Core or Mono or something to allow you to port it onto a Linux underlay. And that would be, like, from a platform perspective, much lower friction. But even when you think of like fundamentals of Kate, so like a CSI driver, when we do a mount in the vSphere CSI driver, that uses the Linux mount command. We don't have support for Windows because we rely on the Linux mount command. So there's just fundamental things that are not quite there because of the differences between the platforms. And I think if you're taking your old applications and just sticking them in a container and saying, hey, look, it runs on Kate's now, which is more often the fact when it comes to those old .NET apps, then you're going to have a bad time. If you take the time to take a .NET app and maybe just even port it to .NET Core or to Mono or another framework, it would still, the bulk of the business logic would be untouched. You change some of the underlying libraries and let it run on Linux, you're going to have a much better time in production than you would having trying to, make a square peg fit.
Yeah. So the use case that I've been confronted with is the wish to port a pretty classical non-cloud native application into containers. The reason is mostly for the deployment model. They like the fact that it's easier to pipeline, and that's it. All other considerations aside, that's why they want it. Now you can argue whether that should be enough of a reason or not, but I totally agree with everything you just said. But that's not enough reason for this particular team to stop.
I've heard stories of people who want to use collateral pieces that they don't even build themselves, like IIS servers and things like this.
Yes, that's also in this case. Yeah, this is an off-the-shelf application, basically.
And I think there is a camp that really wants this to work. It's just that, and I think the people working on Windows with Kubernetes say that the core piece of it works, but I think this story of your storage drivers and CNI networking is something you better look at with a microscope at this stage.
Yeah, that's what I figured, yeah. Okay, cool.
One other thing I want to throw out there, I have to confess that I'm less than a newbie on this because I've never even tried to fire it up, but it sounds like a few of you on the call have. I'm even wondering about licensing and things. Like, let's just say that I'm geek enough that I want to try to get Windows containers running in my home lab. Does Microsoft have a kind of a free to use version of whatever I need, or do I have to go out and buy Windows Server licenses to manage to play around with this?
There's 180-day trials of all their products, but you need to reinstall it every 180 days, which is kind of a pain. Like, that's the way, if I ran a lab in the past, I would just use the thing and then blow it away, rebuild it every half a year. So it's kind of a pain, but it can be done.
The other question I have is, would you advise, or is it even feasible to do a mixed mode Kubernetes? In some circumstances, for example, I found that if you're going to go ARM versus x86, if you have mixed nodes in your Kubernetes cluster, some of which are ARM, some of which are x86, you might be kind of swimming upstream against the current. And is Windows like that, where if I attempted to have a Kubernetes cluster that had a mix of worker nodes, some of which were Linux and some of which were Windows, is that viable?
I mean, I think that comes back to the ARM versus x86 conversation, because it's basically the same thing. And like David said, there's just random stuff doesn't work. And I run a Raspberry Pi ARM cakes cluster here at home.
Mhm.
And I would say 50 to 60% of the containers I run on it, I've had to build custom images because they're not compiled for ARM. And you're going to have the exact same thing whenever it comes to Windows. Some stuff, sure, is going to work. But I would say it's going to be a very ARM type experience where you're going to have to set up your own CI pipelines for every container you want to run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm very curious about the Microsoft support for this, because I mean they're also doing a lot of work themselves for AKS, where they've built a lot of that automation, that logic, and they have they've obviously enabled a lot of that stuff. And I'm sure a lot of it is exposed through, Azure DevOps, for example. I'm just wondering how much of that they're willing to open source, as it were, to create frameworks and methods that are actually usable, the licensing just being one thing.
Yeah, I doubt if anybody on this call can speak for Microsoft's plans, although to my knowledge, maybe there is some sort of a group associated with Microsoft has a cloud provider working group that's a little different though, that's more addressed with running Kubernetes on the Azure cloud than which is potentially orthogonal to Windows containers. And to my knowledge, there is no user group for running Kubernetes on Windows platform. So I don't know, maybe somebody can answer that on this call. And I think next week we will have people, I mean, VMware has people who are working with Microsoft on getting Windows containers to work, just simply because our user base for people on the vSphere platform, we recognize that there are plenty of people who were using the vSphere hypervisor to run Windows VMs. And, that Venn diagram of people who use Windows VMs and people who are interested in using Windows containers has a lot of overlap. So we're not ignoring it. On this call, this is pretty much segregated to open source, and even I can't talk about future VMware product, and even if I could, the Kubernetes SIG working group and user group rules would prevent me from talking about commercial product and turning it into a product pitch. But I think that next month we may have some people who can address this a little better than, I think at this point, the 7 people in this meeting right now are just speculators and not authoritative, sorry.
Well, and just to also throw in a little bit more info, so that link that I gave out in the chat. So yeah, the recommended way of supporting Windows containers in Kubernetes is having just Windows worker nodes only hooked up to Linux masters. And then you can have a mix, and then, which I've set up, it hasn't been pretty, let's just put it that way. And you need to effectively use zones. If you really care about how things run and the stability of everything, you segregate your Windows worker nodes into zones, and you basically target based on that.
Yeah, the other thing that comes to mind, if this is like x86 versus ARM, and I suspect it is, your container image registry, whether you'd elect to try to commingle them in one Docker container image registry or separate them into 2 different ones. I think there's a fair number of moving parts that would come into consideration, but hey, this is all good because it sounds like we'll have a rich topic for a month from now when we can recruit speakers. I will take the challenge and go out and find people to give a deeper dive. So it's interesting that we've got all these questions, because I think there's.
And then also, just to echo what Miles said for the CNI support, yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah. Well, I know that there is at least one CNI, which is the Antria, which I think has that at a minimum on the roadmap if it isn't already supported. So I don't think obviously if you don't have a CNI at all, it wouldn't run. So there's got to be some CNI out there. If people declared that this was stable, they had to have some platform to test it on. I don't know what that CNI is, but there has to be one out there that does support it.
I would say 90% of the CNIs that I've come across use IP tables for their rules. Yep. So if you don't have IP tables, you're going to have a real bad time. So I don't know if Antria, I'm pretty sure Antria doesn't use IP tables.
No, it definitely doesn't. It's Open vSwitch, and I believe Open vSwitch does, it is supportable on Windows. Now, that said, I'm not sure if it's declared a stable release for Windows support there yet, but if I definitely do know that if it isn't already stable, it's on the roadmap, and their tech is capable of supporting the Windows platform. There's such a huge variation in CNIs. I was just looking into that. There now are, well, I guess it isn't quite the number you have with storage plugins, but there are over 35 CNIs now, and they're definitely not all based on IP tables. The other thing that I think Robert brought up was the sidecar. So Istio Service Mesh would be another interesting story. I mean, if you've got sidecars, I don't honestly know. I'm too much of a noob here to know whether every sidecar you have also has to be a Windows container, but I suspect it does. And that would imply that if you were going to use Istio Service Mesh, that maybe that becomes an issue. I don't suppose anybody here in the meeting happens to know. Once again, I'll see what I can get for next meeting. We're kind of going off on a tangent because this particular group is supposed to be constrained to the vSphere platform, but I gather I'll accept this challenge just because it should indeed run on the vSphere platform, and I think there's a huge intersection of people who are interested in Windows containers wanting to run on-prem. So we're not oblivious to the fact that if there's demand for this at all, there's going to be demand for doing it on the vSphere platform. So on that basis, I'm going to declare that it's within scope for this group, especially since I'm not aware of another Windows container specific user group. So I'll take this on. So we're nearing the halfway mark, and I see we've got a speaker. Miles, I'll let you, since you arranged this, I'll let you do the intro here and kick it off.
Sure thing. So Jing has kindly agreed to join us. She's one of the chairs on SIG storage, I believe. So she's going to take us through what's new or what's coming in CSI 119 and 1.20 as well. You know, what's alpha, what's beta, what's going stable, and just give us a general sort of overview of where things are headed with that project.
And I just made you a co-host, so hopefully you saw that in the Zoom interface.
We can't hear you, you're muted.
Oh.
Okay, okay, can you hear me now?
Gotcha.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Miles, for the introduction. So let me share my screen. So my name is Xinyan. I work in the cloud storage team in VMware. I'm one of the co-chair in SIG storage. So I'll be talking about what's coming in 1.19 and 1.20 release, in 1.19 and 1.20 release for Kubernetes CSI. Does this look right? Maybe I need to do presentation mode.
I think you can do either one. It was readable. So
okay.
I know sometimes I like to see speaker notes and things, and do whatever is comfortable for you.
Sure. Yeah. So we do have quite a few alpha features planned for 1.19. So just go over them. The first one is the CSI volume health. So this feature allows a CSI driver to communicate with the storage system and figure out whether a volume is healthy or not. And if not, it can report that back to the Kubernetes, and Kubernetes can report as events. So this is both on the controller plugin side and on the node plugin side. In Kubernetes, we will be having a volume health monitoring controller that communicates to the CSI controller plugin to get those information, and those will be reported on PVC as events. And if it's on the node side, we have an agent on the node, which communicate with the node plugin, and that will be reported on pod. So user can look at those events and decide what to do with those volumes. Because right now, without this events, after volumes provisioned, Kubernetes is not really communicate with the storage system anymore to see whether the volume is healthy or not. So this should be very helpful. We are doing implementation now. The CAP was merged actually in 1.18. So we are wrapping up the implementation for the controller and agent. I think this one is in good status to get in 1.19 as an alpha feature. And the next one is CSI storage capacity tracking. So this allows the CSI driver to report capacity, which is associated with the node topology and the storage class. So we actually already have this get capacity RPC in the CSI, but we are adding a new API object in Kubernetes called CSI storage capacity. It is a core API object, and it will be collecting those capacity information based on what the driver has reported from the get capacity method. And the scheduler will be looking at the available capacity reported when doing placement of the volumes. So this one, the CAP was merged in 1.19, and then there are several PRs out. They're being reviewed. I think this one is also in good status. It should be merged by the deadline, I think. And the next one is the recovery from volume expansion failure. So this one is actually one of the bug fixes that is required for volume expansion feature to go GA. We track this one separately because this one need a feature gate by itself. So this one is also targeting 1.19. This is basically allow user to recover from volume expansion failure caused by insufficient quota. So without this fix, if you try to expand the volume and then if it fails because there's not enough quota, then there's no way to recover from it. So this actually allows you to do that. So you can actually go to retry with a smaller size, and then hopefully that will be smaller than the quota, then that'll be successful. But this does not really support shrinking though. So it must be still bigger than your original size. This one is also, I think, there's a PR out being reviewed. I think this one should get in. And the next one is the CSI generic inline ephemeral volume feature. So right now we actually already has a CSI inline volume feature, which is already in beta that defines this inline volume in the pod definition. But that one has some, it's not very flexible. So this new proposal basically want to have a new type, which is also inline, but it is more like a PVC style. So we can actually make some placement decision to make sure that we actually have enough storage, but it is still, ephemeral, is still basically has the same life cycle with the pod. The cap was merged in 1.19, but I think during reviews, there are some concerns on this API. One is that this is another API that is about ephemeral volume. Is it possible to combine this one with the existing inline volume? So there are concerns like that. And also there are also security concerns with this. I think there are discussions on that review of those PRs. Not sure this one can get in, this might not. And the next one is allow Cesar driver to skip security Linux relabeling. This one basically just add an option, a flag in the CSI driver spec for a driver to say whether I want to support this or not. Because if you don't, then basically by default, it's going to do the relabeling for all the files in the file system. If this secure Linux is enabled, and it could be very time consuming. So this one, I think there are some discussions. So and I think there is an update to the original cap trying to redo the design. So this one may not make it in 1.19. And the next one is allow CSI driver to indicate the FS group support. This one also targeting alpha in 1.19. This one basically also has a new option added in CSI driver spec to say whether we want to support FS group or not. But this one, I think also there are some concerns, some questions raised in the review to decide whether this one should be combined with other options. So this one also is in question on whether this one will be merged or not in 1.19. And the next one is the CSI migration. So in general, the CSI migration is already a beta feature. For vSphere CSI driver, we just started this one in this release. So we want to target beta, but I think there are some requirements for CSI testing results to be published. So I think we are still working on that. If we get that done before the merge deadline, which is actually next Thursday, then we can, it's still possible for us to go beta, otherwise it's going to be alpha. So we actually already have the in-tree code changes merged, which has a translation library that allow us to migrate from the in-tree CSI driver, from the in-tree driver to the CSI vSphere driver. So there is one requirement that is for the CSI migration to work. There is a requirement for vSphere to be 7.0 So if you are at a version before that, then this solution will not work. So right now we are looking at it and see whether there are some other migration solutions if customers cannot upgrade to 7.0 because the plan is in 1.20 release, the in-tree driver will be removed.
Is that current across all drivers, Jing, that in 1.20 all core provider plugins are going to be deleted essentially?
1.21. So that's the plan. Yeah, but that's the plan. But I think it's not like 100% saying that it's definitely going to happen, but that's the target basically. But
so are they just waiting for the migration paths for each of those cloud providers to be implemented to remove the core code then?
Yeah, so all of those drivers, right, the cloud provider drivers need to have this migration path before the entry driver can be removed. So all of them have already been either alpha or beta. Yeah, some are already beta. So I think right now the problem right now we are trying to find, maybe you also have some information on this one. We don't know how many customers are still at earlier versions, and then whether it is possible for them to upgrade to 7.0.1. If not, then we need to figure out some other ways. Because our CSI driver itself actually can support lower versions, 6, 7, I forgot it is
U3.
U3, okay. Yeah, so if customer has been using that, they don't need a migration from entry, then that's fine, right? So they can actually still stay at the older vSphere version. But if they need to migrate from entry to CSI, then here's the requirement. Then otherwise, then we need to figure out some other way. So right now we have not, we're still looking into it. Any more questions here? Should I move to the next? Okay. So for upcoming beta features, so.
Oh, wow, this is timely because you arrived late, but the first half of the meeting was discussing Windows container support. So this is great that you're covering it.
So there is, yeah, so there is a alpha, it's already alpha actually. And we're targeting beta in 1.19 for the Windows CSI Windows support, but I'm not sure whether it's going to make it because I know there are a group of people who they actually have regular meetings and then they work on this, but I'm not sure if it's going to be beta, it may not, because I have not got any update on that one, but at least right now it is already alpha. But I don't know that we have done any testing within the vSphere yet. That I'm not sure.
I was because we were just talking earlier on about some of the external dependencies that CSI might have. For example, the mount command and things like that. How do we sort of implement a driver that can work on either Windows or Linux? There would have to be some sort of logic that determines the platform and then changes how volumes get mounted and everything based on what the platform is?
That's a good question. So I don't think we have done any support on this. So, but I know that this particular implementation, there is a component called the CSI proxy. So I think for Windows support, you do have to implement that way. So I think it's has to be different. I don't think you can, I think the code will be very different. But I just have not really looked at the driver.
No, let me ask you this. It's, there's 3 parts of CSI. It starts with the spec that is kind of an independent of Kubernetes project, just because CSI was deemed to be cross-orchestrator, where it could be used with Mesos, Kubernetes, Docker. And I don't know if anything had to be done at the spec level to support Windows or not. Then going from the spec over to the Kubernetes project, there's an effort to integrate support of that CSI spec into Kubernetes itself. And then third, there are individual implementations of CSI compliant storage plugins. And some of those may or may not have issues when running on Windows, right? I mean, anything from some of those use or interface to custom hardware HBAs, some of them interface to storage over pretty generic networking, iSCSI, TCP, whatever. But maybe you could tell us about what all the potential issues there are if somebody wanted to get storage support for running Windows containers.
So to be honest with you, I really have not followed up with the Windows support. But there is no special CSS spec change for this though.
Okay.
So CSS spec at least is the same, but we do have a sub project. Well, it's actually under Kubernetes CSI, we do have a component called CSI proxy. So that is for Windows support. But actually really did not look into it to see how that works. And also our driver has not really tried to qualify this one yet. So is that something that we should be looking into? Then maybe I can bring this back to our team.
Okay, that's fair. I mean, it seems like if the host is Windows, that there's a lot of moving parts there, even getting down to the OS drivers getting involved, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely is challenging. Yeah, I know there was a few people working on that. I know they have a lot of issues, but at least now we are actually incorporating the Windows build into our sidecars now. So like all of our sidecars now have build for Windows as well. So.
You mean in like CSI attacher, CSI provisioner, those ones?
Yeah, those also has a build for, you can also build for Windows.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, well there you go, Robert. There is some progress in that direction. So
yeah, do you need any, do you want me to find more information on this? I can look at some existing documentation. Would that help?
So Stephen is planning to have someone next month on the next call to talk specifically to Windows container support.
Okay.
But what you're saying here should definitely be, you should zoom in on that during that session, because that's exactly what the information I was asking about earlier in the call. So it's good. Okay. It's good to hear that there's progress. That's nice.
Okay. And with regard to generic CSI, hopefully, can we get a link to this deck, or if you can shoot it to me on Slack, I'll put it in the meeting notes.
Yeah,
and
I will
then,
send to you.
Maybe a few links on where people can get involved if they want to get really hardcore on CSI storage and Kubernetes, just to, because, this is a user group for vSphere, but certainly within the Kubernetes project, storage itself is a very active group with a lot of sessions that might be relevant if you're a storage geek. And this goes beyond potentially a CSI too. I mean, the implication is that if you're using CSI storage, you're perhaps trying to run stateful apps. And if you're going into production, you need to be worried about more than just your storage interface. There's a whole realm of how you would do DR planning, backup, restore, snapshotting of volumes, and a lot of the stuff is moving to a pretty stable condition. But I think it might be helpful if we can drop some links about where people can go to get involved and learn more about all of what's going on, especially since this is a user-focused group. The Kubernetes project is always asking for feedback from users, because unfortunately, I think, some of these groups are just wall-to-wall developers and very few users showing up. And it's always great to get a vigorous channel going from users to make sure that what's getting built by the developers actually meets the needs of the users.
Yeah, that's definitely excellent point. So I can add one slide at the end, just to list all the resources, where you go to attend meetings, where are the documentations. I can do that.
Okay, great.
I have a question to you, Stephen, and to Miles. So currently, a number of the VMware products use a customized version of the CSI driver. I've added a link in the chat to Cormac Hogan's post describing the differences in support between the different storage abstraction layers in the vSphere products versus which drivers are being used and how those features differ. Is it, and if you're not able to speak to this, of course, I understand, but is it VMware's intention to move purely to the upstream CSI driver once that becomes more feature complete?
So I had a conversation earlier on with product managers about this, and obviously we can't talk about futures, anything we say is under the disclaimer of, there's no promises. For the time being, we're going to maintain two separate CSI drivers. So there's the one for vSphere with Kubernetes, which Cormac has listed in separate columns. And then there's the upstream CSI driver. And there is some feature lag on the one in vSphere with Kubernetes because we've had to re-implement some of those features using something called the PV CSI driver. So it's got two parts and we need to re-implement some of that. There is a desire to try and coalesce that and make the re-implementation bit sort of go away over time. What the timescale looks like on that, I don't even know, so I can't tell you. But ideally, less code is better, right? If there's less code, there's less bugs. So if we have to re-implement it twice, there's going to be, you know, twice the scope for things to go wrong. So yes, in an ideal world, we would like to coalesce that into one over time. As for feasibility of that, I guess we're just going to have to see. But the feature matrix that Cormac has here, yes, we absolutely want to make sure that the same features are supported across all of those versions. So you don't need the matrix anymore. That would be perfect. But as for exact timelines, we're not totally sure yet.
And I think you're talking about the Kubernetes bundled with vSphere. And we do have other Kubernetes distros that maybe have a different story.
Yes.
And in addition to that, we're fully committed to supporting pure upstream Kubernetes as well as Kubernetes distros by other vendors like Red Hat OpenShift. So I wish it wasn't so complex a story where, you know, the fact that you even need a blog post on a matrix tells you that maybe it isn't a perfect world, but it is what it is, and we're trying to listen. So,
but as it stands, Robert, the upstream CSI has more features in it. It's got read-write menu support and, you know, offline volume grow that Jane was working on. So there's stuff in the upstream CSI driver that isn't in the vSphere with Kubernetes one. Again, because there's the lag, it was implemented afterwards. So it'll be playing catch up for a little while, but it will get to feature parity at some point.
Yeah, so for the resize at least, we actually already finished the code for the guest cluster support. So we do have resize support for the guest cluster at least. That's in the next release.
and for some not familiar with the term upstream, I think, is it fair to say, Miles, that the story is we're not withholding any hidden features beyond a paywall. We've got the open source version out there that is fully featured, and that is the case, right?
To be honest, the upstream one has more features than the one that's, you know, the custom one. So if anything, running TKGI or, you know, native TKG, you're going to get that upstream experience versus something like vSphere with Kubernetes where you get the custom one. So, and like Steve said, you know, it'll run with OpenShift, Anthos, Rancher, Docker E, whatever it is that you want. So it's not like if you're running Kubernetes on vSphere, you only get this subset. If you're running upstream vanilla Kubernetes distro of any kind, you can use the upstream CSI and you'll get all the good stuff. But yeah,
okay, did that cover your question, Robert? Or
yeah, that's very good. Yeah, thank you. It's good.
And, you know, we're always trying to help here. That the Slack channel for the Kubernetes user group gets a pretty regular stream of questions. So if you can help us with feedback on making how well this is documented better, I'm interested in doing that. So, you know, this Cormac blog post is a great resource, but tell us where things are confusing or where things could be done better, and I'll take a mission to make sure that the documentation story on the support is as simple as it can be. Unfortunately, for the time being, it does have to be in some form of a matrix because it's a little different on different platforms, but we're striving to make it better. Okay, we've got time check. We've got about 6 minutes left. Does anybody have any closing remarks on this, on CSI with Kubernetes on the vSphere platform, or CSI in general? Well, Jing is with us. And any other topics that any members want to bring up and put on the table. Or I think we've got queued up a rich set of things to discuss for next meeting, but if you've got any ideas for things you'd like at a future meeting, now's the time to mention it. You can challenge Miles and I to go recruit speakers on the topic of your desires.
Yeah, next time, actually, just for sort of a sneak peek, and I put it in the doc there, we've got Dan Finneran, again, from VMware, and he's going to come talk to us about Cube VIP, which is a new load balancer that they built internally, well, internally, it's open source, to sort of act as a replacement for HA proxy. So you can use it inside Kubernetes clusters or outside Kubernetes clusters. So it will either go in front of control plane nodes, so you can load balance your control plane nodes, or you can use it as a load balancer service inside Kubernetes. And there's a bunch of stuff in there. It's kind of like Metal Load Balancer, but it lets you load balance the control planes as well, not just the services, which is kind of cool. And I had a chat with him earlier on today about adding support for maybe claiming addresses from DHCP so that you don't have to give it a static block and assign from a static block. It would just claim release and then use it for a VIP. So there's a bunch of really cool developments that are being added in that area. So he's going to come and do a quick overview and a demo of how to set it up and how to use it.
That sounds great. I think you missed that one session, but we had Bryson of Walmart was asking for this a month or two ago, and we covered Metal LB and some concerns people have. But that topic of running a load balancer on-prem is always a challenge. You know, when you host in a cloud, one of the major cloud providers, they of course provide a load balancer as a service for you. But as soon as you drop down on-prem, you own the load balancer, the ingress controllers, and I think people, it's a mixed story where Kubernetes allows maximal flexibility by not forcing one selection down your throat, but it means that you do have to do some research to find one, and they're not all the same. So it sounds like a great topic for next time. Anybody out there interested in that, if you've got specific questions for the speaker, why don't you either drop them in the Slack channel or put them in the agenda doc? And it's always nice if we can give a speaker a little runway to, you know, maybe do a slide or two on a question rather than just drop it on them with a few seconds notice. I know when I'm speaking, you always prefer to get questions in advance if it's possible. Okay, if last call, does anybody have anything else to nominate for talking about today or for the next meeting? And if not, I'll shut down the recording and declare this done. Going on. Okay, thanks everyone for attending. The next meeting is going to be Thursday, first week of August, and we'll see you then. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Jing, for coming on to talk to us as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, guys. That was really good.
Bye.